Hi, good afternoon. This is Biswajit here, CEO of Coastr. We are all about revolutionizing the mobility industry through innovative and smart technology. Really excited to kind of welcome you to our webinar today, where we are looking to debunk some of the biggest myths around EV and fleet. So I'll get started with a few stats, maybe just in the interest of starting the conversation, setting some context, and then introducing Chris and Catherine, and then we will go into some Q&As with them. So first of all, electric vehicles. I mean, some of the stats which have been shared with me from my team, 62% of people believe EVs have a high upfront cost. 58% of potential buyers worry about range and that they would be left stranded midway during their long journeys. I mean, I can't imagine what that would look like. 60% think that there aren't enough charging stations or that charging takes too long. And then, yes, there are beliefs that EV technology will actually make it worse because of the issues around battery production and disposal of batteries. So with those kind of stats in mind, I'm quite excited to kind of present Chris Chandler from Lex Autolease. Chris is a highly regarded fleet management consultant with over 27 years of experience, specializing in environmental fleet management and vehicle technologies. He has worked with key organizations such as the Energy Saving Trust, OLEV, and of course BVRLA to promote cleaner vehicles and sustainable transport. Chris has been recognized with awards like Energy Saving Trust's Green Fleet Hero Award in 2015 and the BVRLA Industry Hero Award in 2021. So well done. At Lex, he's the head of UK's largest alternative fuel fleets, and he's also the SME for electric vehicles and alternative fuels for Lloyd's Transport, overseeing brands like Lex Autolease and Tusker. I hope I've covered that correctly, Chris. We have also in our esteemed panel Catherine Bowen, who has been with BVRLA since 2019 as Senior Policy Advisor. Catherine leads the association's work on decarbonization and future of mobility with a specific focus on electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Again, you have huge, over 17 years of experience in senior policy roles with a wealth of experience across the public, private, and non-profit sector. Welcome to both of you, and we are excited to hear from Chris and Catherine. So if I get started with some of the key questions, the first one probably aimed at Chris. So Chris, if you don't mind kind of sharing some of your insights and what are the most bizarre or surprising EV myths that you have come across in your line of work, if you want to share some of those insights with our audience today.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there are some strange ones, such as you can't drive electric vehicles in the rain, which I'm sure nowadays people have seen the vehicles driving out in the rain. But I suppose for me, probably the most bizarre myth is not the myth itself, but it's how widespread and how far the myth has traveled. And that's that electric vehicles regularly burst into flames. On the internet, on social media, and even in mainstream media, you see these stories of electric vehicles sort of catching fire. And the truth of the matter is they are far, far, far less likely to catch fire than a petrol or diesel vehicle. Now, thankfully, modern vehicle technology is good, so it's not a common event. But if you like, just to put some focus onto that, Lex Autolease has been running electric vehicles since beginning of 2011. We had the first 2 Nissan Leafs sort of in the country were put out to one of our customers, and at the moment across Lloyd's Transport we've got 160,000 pure electric vehicles on the fleet, and we haven't had one catch fire spontaneously in that whole time. So I suppose the bizarre thing is how strong that myth seems to persist. And in the UK, we had a terrible fire at Luton Airport in one of the multi-storey car parks, and immediately that was attributed to an electric vehicle. It wasn't; it was a diesel vehicle, and now we've seen all the detail behind that, and we know about that fire. But some people still think that was an electric vehicle that either started it or exacerbated it. So I suppose that's probably the strangest for me, in the fact that that myth just seems to persist despite the evidence against it.
Indeed, Chris. I think some of it is also the evolution of this technology, right? Because I think electric vehicles have been around almost like a decade, coming on to a decade now, and there have been potentially some incidents in the start off, like with any new technology. But to your point, the technology has rapidly gained innovation and traction. So clearly a myth that people need to feel more confident about EV vehicles. Thank you. My next one is with Catherine. So I think one of the major kind of conversations around EVs is always the EV infrastructure, and especially when I talk to a lot of our customers in the commercial vehicle space, I think they talk about the lack of charging stations being a big roadblock to EV adoption. What would be your point of view in terms of the kind of public and private investments that are essential to build the capability across the UK?
Yes, I think Chris spoke there about myths that persist, and I think infrastructure perhaps is another one. And before I sort of directly answer the question, maybe it's just worth setting the scene a little bit. So we do an annual Road to Zero report card where we assess where we are on the road to zero for cars, vans and trucks, and we look at supply, demand and infrastructure. In the latest report, it shows that we are actually tracking against a curve towards 300,000 charge points by 2030. Now, that was a target that the government set in its EV infrastructure strategy, saying that we would need a minimum of 300,000. And we are continuing to track against it. Obviously, the closer we get to 2030, the curve gets much steeper. So whether we continue to see that momentum remains to be seen. But at the moment we are. We've also seen huge improvements in things like the reliability of charge points, and there's more to come. So the government put some legislation in place to improve the consumer experience. Some of that came into effect last year, but we're going to see more. One of those is around reliability. The government wants to see a 99% reliability standard, which will come in from November. Again, in our Road to Zero report card, we weren't far off. We were at about 98.1%, but the number of charge points out of order had fallen dramatically from 4.5% back in 2023 to just 1.4% in April. Looking at the number of charge points and looking at ZapMap, we're up to over 70,000 as of the end of September, and that's a 41% increase year on year. So we are continuing to see investment into charging infrastructure. The majority of that growth, though, has actually been in rapid and ultra rapid charging, where we're starting to see more of the 150 kilowatt hour chargers, and obviously more vehicles now coming to market that can take that sort of power of charge as well. Albeit that can be quite costly, but then people aren't going to be relying on that type of charging on a day-to-day basis. It's there to be able to quickly charge and on you go. Interestingly, the network with most charge points is Ubertricity, and that's with the kind of lamppost chargers, followed by Connected Curb, which is very much focused on street charging. So, and that's largely been as a result of the Levi funding. So the government introduced the local EV infrastructure fund, I think it was last year, and we're starting to see a lot of local authorities rolling out curbside on-street charging. So we're getting, lots more charge points that provide that whole mix. Charging hubs as well. We're now up to over 450 with 200 new hubs that have been introduced since the start of the year. So again, this is showing that there is strong investment by the private sector. And we're also seeing a lot of the motorway service areas now with high power charging. And I'm sure Chris can talk about his trips on the EV rally and the growth in charging just over the last couple of years. There are still some regional disparities. So I think when we talk about where investment is needed, it is on making sure that we've got good coverage across the whole of the country. But through the Levi funding, I think we are going to see, more charging put in places for people that perhaps don't have the ability to charge at home. And that's where we have got a bit of a challenge in how we cater for people that, can't use their private driveway. We're also waiting to hear more about the Rapid Charge Fund. So that's where there'll be the cabling to provide charging infrastructure. So a lot of the motorway service areas didn't have the power. So the Rapid Charge Fund is to deliver that power to the motorway service areas. So again, hopefully we'll get to see more coverage across the country. I know that it's also a Labour Party commitment to accelerate the rollout of charging, and it's something that I've heard Lillian Greenwood, the Transport Minister, mention a few times. So yeah, they're definitely going to be focused on rolling out charging infrastructure. But again, going back to the start, I think it is one of those myths that tends to persist, and
Yes.
perhaps the reality isn't quite as people might expect.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question on that, Catherine, if you don't mind me kind of jumping in on that. Another myth or sort of, kind of discussion I've kind of had is with a few people is it's great we are promoting a lot of EVs and the infrastructure is there, but if everyone goes into EVs, is there enough power in the grid to actually support that?
Yeah, so all of the conversations I've ever heard and been party to suggest that, yeah, there's more than enough power. I think we reached a peak in terms of our power demand back in, I want to say 2007. But since then, a lot of household goods are a lot more efficient. So, but also we're producing a lot more renewable energy via wind, solar, etc. So, yeah, and also I think we'll see more smart charging and tariffs that encourage us to sort of use energy when it's at its peak.
And I think just to add a little bit on that, if I may, Catherine's absolutely right. At the moment in the UK, we've got wind farms where we're actually switching the turbines off because the grid's at capacity. And so, we're actually turning the sustainable energy generation off because we're at capacity. We've got plenty of generation. It's the time, as Catherine said, charging at night. It's the time of day and it's avoiding the peak demands, or storing energy in low demand times and then feeding it back into the grid at peak.
Makes sense. Well, I think this leads into kind of my next question to Chris. So, there's a common perception that EVs are just for the wealthy. I mean, probably EV cars were quite expensive at one point. I mean, can you break this down for us just in terms of, what are the advantages of actually switching to EVs and how to break that common perception?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's be honest. When a new technology comes to market, whether it's Apple bringing out an iPhone that started off very much for wealthy or tech hungry people, and now school kids have them. It's the same thing. When EVs first came out, they were the top end vehicles. There was a price premium for them, and I suggest that was absolutely true. As we develop the technology, which the manufacturers have been doing now, some of them for 15 plus years in this iteration of looking at electrification, because there were electric vehicles in the late 1800s, but the technology gets cheaper as we get more mass production, as the battery technology develops and changes. So some of the harder to get minerals and metals within them, we now have cobalt free batteries, for example. That's all making vehicles more affordable and actually perform better. So if we think back to just 10 13 years ago with the first Nissan Leaf that had a 70-mile range and could charge at 50 kilowatts. You know, that was an expensive car for what it was. Now we've got vehicles that can do easily over 300-mile range, that can charge at over 350 kilowatts. And so basically, that technology is making them more affordable, and the fact that it's no longer the new technology. So they were expensive to start with, and there are still expensive electric vehicles out there, but we're also now getting vehicles at the lower end of the market for affordability. We're seeing all vehicle prices reduce, but what we've seen recently, which I think is really exciting for electric mobility for all, there are cars like the Dacia Spring, which is just under £15,000. Now, it is a smaller city vehicle and it has got range limitations, but it's perfect for a lot of people. And so we're getting more affordable vehicles like that. Something that we're doing at Lex Autolease and some of our other brands is we're now leasing and financing used electric vehicles, which again lowers the affordability entry level for electric vehicles. And then there's the other aspect, because electric vehicles in some cases may be more expensive, or the monthly rental might seem a bit more expensive, but there are lots of operational cost savings. Our maintenance budgets for electric vehicles, if you're looking at a typical 4-year replacement cycle, they're about 37% cheaper, and that includes tyres, because a lot of people think EVs eat tyres. A lot of EVs are quite powerful. It's how you drive, not necessarily the weight of the vehicle that makes the tyres wear quicker. But even with tyres put in, about 37% cost reduction over an equivalent internal combustion engine vehicle. And there are some manufacturers where maintenance is really low, that can be 45% cheaper. So you save money on the maintenance of the vehicle. And probably the big one is obviously the fuel. And as Catherine's already intimated out with the charging, if you're charging at a motorway service station on a charging hub, you will be paying a price premium, because there's lots of things behind that. Ultra rapid chargers are expensive to install. You have cable laying for high voltage cabling, etc. So there is a capex cost that needs to be paid off there. But if you're charging on the public network on ultra rapids, then you may be paying a little bit more than diesel.
Yeah.
However, if you can charge at home, or you can do overnight 7.5 kilowatt charging, which the majority of EV drivers do, you can be driving an electric vehicle for as little as 8p per mile on standard rates. Or, for instance, for me, I'm on a special overnight tariff to encourage that spreading the peak periods of electricity away to the off-peak. So for 4.5 hours after midnight 30, I only pay 8p a kilowatt. So at 8p a kilowatt, I've got a Model 3 Tesla that's got a 330-mile range on motorways. And for that, I'm paying about £6 to completely fill my vehicle up. So for charging at home, there are very, very significant cost savings to be had if you keep an eye on the best tariffs and the best times to charge. And then finally, and this is something sort of very specific to the UK and company car drivers or people whose business has a salary sacrifice scheme, that there are very significant benefits to having a battery electric vehicle over an internal combustion engine vehicle under the UK's benefit in kind tax schemes.
Yeah.
And those are, very, very significant savings. They're based on the CO2 emissions of a petrol or diesel vehicle, but for electrics, it's 2%. So you could be getting a 30% saving over a diesel vehicle or a petrol vehicle in using a pure electric. And that quite simply is why at the moment, if you look at the corporate and South SAC markets, they're really leading the charge, excuse the pun, on the journey to electrification over retail, because in the retail there are much fewer absolute incentives for going electric, but the affordability is there. You just got to look for the bit to fit your budget, and the Dacia Spring is not the only sort of vehicle now available under 20,000, but officially it's the cheapest in the UK at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. I think you've broken down the benefits in terms of maintenance and fuel quite well. I think that definitely should encourage, hopefully, some of our viewers to switch to electric if they've been sitting on the sidelines. It does lead into my next question to Catherine, which is more around, how do you see the impact of government incentives, which Chris mentioned, the BIK benefits and salary sacrifice schemes? So could you explain a bit more about the benefits that are there, both for retail and commercial, operators for that matter?
Yeah, so I mean, Chris has mentioned the benefit in kind. That is definitely one of the big incentives that's really driven demand. And we're seeing huge growth in salary sacrifice schemes and people opting for salary sacrifice and electric company cars because of the benefit in kind taxation rates. We're obviously keen to stress that now is not the right time to remove those incentives, especially when fleets really are the driving force behind increased adoption. We still have grants for some vehicle types, so vans and trucks still have the plug-in grants that are available, albeit they are due to end in March next year. We are pushing to see those extended because there are some challenges with e-van adoption that we want to overcome, and we think that the continuation of the plug-in van grant would really help there. Grants also on the charging side. So there's still a workplace charging scheme that enables businesses to claim £350 per socket. I think that's up to a maximum of about £14,000, and support for SMEs as well in terms of the cost of the infrastructure, so the cabling to support that charge point. And I think that's about £850 per charge point, up to a £15,000 limit. And then I mentioned earlier the local EV infrastructure fund. That's very much tailored towards local authorities to help them with the installation of charging, particularly to help those that don't have the ability to charge at home. So it has mainly been focused on street charging. And yeah, they're all of the incentives and sort of grants that are still available. Who knows what will come from the budget that's coming up at the end of this month, but fingers crossed we do get to see the retention of some of those grants, for certainly on the commercial vehicle side where we think that support needs to continue.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much, Catherine, for sharing that. I'm interested, in the interest of time, I have one last question to you before we move into some of the questions that are coming through from the audience. So, I mean, we've talked about obviously kind of all the benefits of transitioning to EVs, and of course debunk some of the myths. There are always going to be negative stories, I guess, around the EV market, with some even confessing that it's a passing fad, I guess. But I'm sure the industry is making strides every day. What are your thoughts on this in general? Where do you see the EV market and the transition going in the next few months or few years? Sorry, whoever wants to go first.
I'm happy to jump in first. Yeah, I mean, we obviously would really like to see the benefit in kind taxation rates stay stable with sort of longer term certainty, because that really is, as I've said before, and Chris mentioned, it really is the driving force. We see that fleets are taking the large proportion of electric vehicles, and that can only grow, and it is really helping with affordability, not just in the first market, but the second hand market and the used products that that Chris mentioned as well. I think we're way beyond this being a fad. If you look at the level of investment going in charging infrastructure, it's definitely beyond a fad, and it's here to stay. I think the key thing to remember, especially from a sort of fleet perspective, is don't wait until you can do everything. Do what you can now. if you wait for the panacea when all of your vehicles, all of your drivers are ready to go electric, then it's going to be you're going to be waiting too long. So just do what you can now and get cracking.
And I mean, I absolutely agree with Catherine there. The only things that I'll add to that is, to my mind, the writing's kind of on the wall. We've got the zero emission vehicle mandate. That gives manufacturers, if you like, the glide path to 2030. Now, again, we've got to wait and see what happens in the budget, because 2030, 2035, there's a blur at the moment as to when effectively all new vehicles, so it's not retrospective, we're not getting rid of petrol and diesel cars that are already on the road, but new cars going forwards will have to be zero emission or have a significant zero emission capability, and that legislation is starting to bite from this year. 22% of all cars have to be zero emission, 10% of all commercial vehicles have to be zero emission, and when you look at that, there are fines in place for the manufacturers. There are also trading schemes and credits, so there's all sorts of things built into that, but the bottom line is they're on a trajectory now to zero emission vehicles. As far as I'm concerned, and I've trialed a lot of different technologies, including hydrogen fuel cells, the product that we have to do this with at the moment is definitely electric. The manufacturers have typically nowadays a 4 to 5 year design and manufacture time frame to bring new product to market. So we're even seeing manufacturers like Maserati now have 2 electric performance cars. Lotus have said they're not doing any more development on petrol engines. And then you've obviously got the disruptors like Tesla, BYD, Aura, who have all come to market with electric vehicles. So I think it's quite difficult to see another technology winning, if you like, at the moment, if it is a race. Electric vehicles do work. The range of the vehicle's good. The infrastructure has grown massively, 41% year on year. So exactly as Catherine said, we have a technology here that works. We've got a vast choice of different vehicle types now, and it's really down to just getting on with the job, in my view.
Thank you, Chris and Catherine. So we'll probably move on to some Q&A, if that's okay. I think I can see a fair number of questions coming through. Let me try and ask some of these because I am also conscious of our time. So the first one, I guess, from one of our audience is, what steps can businesses take to make the transition to electric vehicles smoother? Whoever wants to pick this up.
Shall I go first on this one, and we'll alternate or something? I mean, to me, Catherine's already slightly sort of covered it in passing. Don't wait for the perfect solution for absolutely everybody. What we always do is we don't look at a fleet as a whole. We look at it as loads of different areas. So what we'll do, we'll look at vehicles that have the right mileage, the right price point, and vehicles available. So if you like, for company cars, there's probably a product for everybody now. For commercial vehicles, we still have some gaps, like four-wheel drive pickup trucks that can be converted to go off-road. So you don't stop your EV transition because you can't get a 4x4 pickup that's electric with the range you want, or that can tow 3.5 ton. You segment it down into the low-hanging fruit, the vehicles where there are electric alternatives available, and the use cases where it works. And then the ones that are slightly more difficult or challenging, you then focus on what needs to happen to make those work and when that might happen. So we've been talking to manufacturers, for instance, about four-wheel drive pickup trucks with off-road capability, because we've got customers who need them, and there isn't a product that's correct and right for them at the moment in the market. But don't do nothing because you're waiting for the fleet to be sorted. Identify the drivers, the vehicles, and the use cases where electric will work, and it will be a large percentage of the fleet, especially the cars. And the difficult to-dos, don't just kick them into the long grass, but think, right, when a product that will meet that comes on, or becomes available in the market, that's when we'll put that strategy into place. When we've got a charging solution for people who can't charge at home, but they take their commercial vehicles home, let's think about how we're going to get around that. We might even have to change the way we do business and the way we operate our fleet. Businesses reshape themselves during COVID because of the changes of COVID. Some businesses now need to change their operating models because we're going over to electric.
The other thing I would add to what Chris has just said there as well is that if you can convert some drivers, then they can start to share their experiences and help with this whole myth busting piece, you know, and show people that actually they are really enjoyable to drive, and you know, some of these challenges are complete myths, and use them to help educate and sort of win the hearts and minds of other drivers who are going to be on the longer term journey.
I completely agree with that. I recall I was once coming back, going to the airport, Luton Airport from Milton Keynes, and I was on a Tesla, and the driver was just, he could not stop about how much he liked driving an electric car. And once you have somebody who's an adopter, I think that really influences others as well. So thank you for sharing that. Let me look at other questions. So there's another one around, are EVs more sustainable than vehicles with alternative fuel like hydrogen? Again,
I'm happy to have a bash with this one. I mean, I am not a hydrogen expert. What I do know from conversations that I've had and again heard is green hydrogen is actually in short supply and perhaps will need to be reserved for some of the really problematic use cases like maritime, aviation, perhaps some of the heavy duty trucks. So what I would say on hydrogen, definitely for cars and vans, is that I think electric is the most viable solution. Don't be waiting for a hydrogen. So they're also a lot more expensive, so trying to make the business case work for hydrogen is going to be even more challenging than perhaps electric. But yeah, I think it will have some use cases, but I can't see it for cars and vans.
Yeah, and agreed. And I've run a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. The infrastructure is a massive issue in the UK. I think we've got about 4 publicly accessible sites. A fuel cell does need that green ultra high grade hydrogen because of the membranes. If there are any sort of if you like pollutants within that fuel, it will damage the membranes. But the other thing to bear in mind is some of the research that I've seen is you get the hydrogen through electrolysis, and then you compress it to 700 bar, which is about 10,500 psi. Then you chill it to -40, and then you deliver it into a tank for a fuel cell. If you compare that to just putting the electricity straight into a battery vehicle, you need about 5 to 6 times more electricity to deliver a driven mile for a hydrogen vehicle than you do for a BEV. So, those who are concerned of, do we have enough electricity, etc., you are using a lot more energy to deliver a mile. And I suggest, if hydrogen does take off in car and vans, and I don't believe it will, if you think how long it's going to take to perfect a lot of that, and then you think that in the last 13 years we've gone from a Leaf 70 miles range 50 kilowatt charging to, as I said earlier, 400-mile range vehicles with 350 kilowatt charging. I mean, my car, I get 200 miles charging it in about 15 to 20 minutes. The only benefit over hydrogen really is the rapid refueling. Well, our battery technology and our charging technology might have taken us to that anyway. So I'm a firm believer that it's going to be aviation and those difficult use cases that Catherine said, where you're going to need vast batteries, maritime, and aviation, where you want lightness, that the hydrogen is going to be put to, not necessarily batteries.
I somehow agree with that as well. Point of view, I've seen a lot of opportunities or use cases where actually hydrogen is being used in aviation, to your point. And Japan is obviously a good adopter of hydrogen fuels in their buses and other things. So there definitely seem to be more use case in the commercial and aviation space. I think I want to pick up on something you just said about other technologies picking up on some of the benefits of hydrogen. One of the upcoming ones is battery swapping technology, or battery as a service type of model. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you see that evolving or really accelerating the EV infrastructure, charging infrastructure?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think there's definitely merit in it, and I think battery swapping, you either do it to increase your range, but the range of the vehicles is now coming, or you do it over concerns around battery degradation, which all of the evidence that is starting to come to light is showing that degradation is nowhere near as bad as we may have feared. So I think it's about 2% a year, which might affect a couple of miles range, but not really anything hugely significant. And in fact, some vehicles, and I'm sure Chris will talk to this, some vehicles have actually got better range, and they've let some of the unused capacity from the battery go via over the air updates. So actually, in some cases, it's got better. I saw another question about rapid charging technology. There were some concerns that perhaps constant rapid charging would degrade the battery. So far, we're not seeing any signs of that. I think it would be interesting to see what happens on the truck side if we start going into the megawatt charging, but that's still quite a way away. But yeah, battery health is nowhere near as bad as people might have feared. And batteries aren't like mobile phones, and they're constantly getting better. But Chris, I'm sure, can talk about this much better than I can.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting one, and I think a good few years ago it was something that people were thinking would really take off. There are advantages of it, there are disadvantages, and some of those disadvantages are the fact that and NIO are doing this. Are you building a network a little bit like Tesla with the supercharging? Are you building a network just for your vehicles? Because the kind of equipment that swaps a battery is not going to be able to cope with a Tesla and a BYD and a NIO. So do we end up with a massive network of all different battery swap stations for different vehicle manufacturers? You've got the added complexities of people like BYD now are doing batteries incorporated into the vehicle. So it's not just a single slab battery underneath. But also it's just the practicalities that some people have been nervous about. I've just bought a brand new car, I go into a battery swap and now I don't know what battery I've got. And another one, and I don't think that's that much of an issue, because like Catherine, I agree that battery degradation has just not been the thing that it was said to be. I drove in the BVRLA this year. I drove a near 9-year-old Tesla Model S with over 250,000 miles on it, and it was still charging at 120 kilowatt, and we were still getting 240 miles out of it. So degradation was probably lost 20 miles range. Now, when you look at that, you then get into the technicalities of, we've got lots of batteries that are waiting at a battery swap centre to go into a car when we're actually struggling to get enough batteries to go into the cars that we want to build. So there is actually another argument about you'll have a lot of dormant batteries waiting to be swapped, and it will be quite a complex model working out where people will be almost out of charge to do a battery swap, because you're not going to want to do a battery swap if you've still got 75% charge, but you just want to get home. You're going to stop and put it on a charger, because battery swapping isn't going to be as cheap as just sticking it on a standard charger. So I think, again, there could be use cases, but I don't think it's something that you're going to see fleet operators use, you know, in the short term. I think the charging speeds have got to a point where most people only have to stop for 15, maybe 20 minutes on an ultra rapid to get the charge that they need to continue their journey.
Certainly. Thank you so much, guys. I think we are almost coming to the end of the session at 45 minutes. So with that, I would like to really, summarize my main takeaway. I would say is like Catherine kind of described and Chris agreed. I think let's not wait for things to be all in place. I think it's important to get started somewhere and do what you can today. I think that was my main takeaway from today's session. Of course, as you get started, all your myths will get debunked at some point, but I think it's most important to get started. So thank you again for sharing your insights today, Chris and Catherine. Really enjoyed the conversation, and I also encourage the audience to get in touch with both of you, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you. Have a lovely rest of the afternoon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.